Every afternoon, just as the shadows began to stretch across the little park nestled between faded apartment buildings, a certain rhythm took over the narrow path that wound between the benches and trees. It wasn't the rhythm of footsteps or passing bicycles. It was the rhythm of stories. And at the heart of it all was a man on a bench. He sat at the same spot each day at exactly 4 p.m. with a small brown book resting in his lap. His hair was thin and white, his back slightly curved, and he always wore a hat with a brim that shaded his face from the afternoon sun. Children came slowly at first, one or two in the early days. But within weeks, the bench in the park was surrounded every afternoon by a growing circle of curious, giggling, wide-eyed listeners. The man told stories, old stories. Tales of dragons who fell in love with stars, of kingdoms that grew upside down, of forests that whispered names. The children listened with the kind of attention that only comes from being truly transported. Some brought juice boxes and crackers to share. Others brought little cushions or blankets. One girl brought her younger brother and held his hand the entire time. And every day the man began with the same line. "Today I will read you a story I love." He would open his little brown book and start reading aloud, his voice gentle but clear, paced like a steady heartbeat. But here's the thing, nobody noticed he never turned a page. His name was Mr. Bin. He had lived in the neighborhood for decades, though few people knew much about him. He lived alone in a small apartment not far from the park. His neighbors knew him as polite and soft-spoken. He greeted people, smiled at pets, and always carried a cloth bag with him. But it wasn't until he began sitting on the park bench every afternoon that people started to truly notice him, not as a man, but as a storyteller. One day, a boy named Min stayed behind after the story ended. He was 8 years old, curious, and not the type to let questions go unanswered. He waited until the last of the other children had waved goodbye and disappeared behind the swings or toward the ice cream cart. Then he approached Mr. Bin. "Ongoy," he said softly, "can I see your book?" Mr. Bin smiled. "You want to read the next story?" Min nodded eagerly. Mr. Bin handed him the book. It was light. Min opened it and froze. It was blank, page after page, completely blank. No words, no letters, just soft, cream-colored paper. He looked up, confused. "But there's nothing here." Mr. Bin chuckled gently. "There's more there than you think." The next day, Min returned with a different question. "Ongoy, how do you read stories with no words?" Mr. Bin looked at him for a long time. Then he took off his hat, revealing a pair of eyes that did not meet Min's gaze. They were clouded, still, quiet. "I don't read," he said. "I remember." Min's eyes widened. "You're blind?" Mr. Bin nodded. "Since before you were born." Min sat beside him, silent, thinking. Then he whispered, "But you still tell the best stories." Mr. Bin smiled. "Because stories live here." He pointed to his chest, "not just in books." That afternoon, Min didn't say anything to the other kids. He just listened, a little closer. And when Mr. Bin began with his usual line, "Today I will read you a story I love," Min smiled quietly to himself, because now he knew. Mr. Bin wasn't reading at all. He was remembering. He was giving. He was choosing to show up every day so that no child had to feel alone after school. Days passed. Then weeks. The group of children grew. Sometimes there were 10, sometimes 20. And once, when the weather was especially kind, more than 30 kids sat cross-legged on the grass, silent and still, listening to Mr. Bin describe the mountain that grew taller each time someone spoke kindly near it. Parents began to notice too. At first they stayed back, watching from a distance. But eventually some began to inch closer, A few sat on benches nearby. Some stood behind trees, listening, not saying a word, not wanting to break the magic. One afternoon, a mother approached Mr. Bin after the story. "My daughter used to be scared of everything," she said. "She wouldn't even talk to strangers. Now she retells your stories at the dinner table." Mr. Bin nodded. "That's because the stories don't belong to me. Once they're told, they're everyone's." Another time, a teacher visited. She sat among the children, her eyes brimming with tears. Later, she said, "You made them believe in magic in a world that often doesn't." Mr. Bin smiled softly. "Magic exists," he said. "It just doesn't shout." One evening, long after the children had left, Min stayed behind again. He had brought a gift. A small box, inside a new book. Braille. Min looked shy as he handed it over. "I asked my uncle to help me find it," he said, "so you can read something new." Mr. Bin ran his fingers over the raised dots. His hands trembled slightly. "Thank you," he whispered. "You gave me so many stories. I wanted to give you one." That night, Mr. Bin didn't sleep. He stayed up, fingertips gliding over the new book, learning, exploring, feeling the shape of words he hadn't yet told. He was ready to start again, not because he had run out of stories, but because he now knew. The stories he told had started to live in others, and that was enough. The next day, a sign appeared next to the bench, a handmade sign, painted in bright, messy colors. It read, "Story time with Ung Bin, 4 p.m. every day." Underneath, "Come with ears open and hearts ready." Mr. Bin didn't put it there, but he didn't take it down. He just smiled, took his seat, held the blank book in his lap, and began again. "Today I will read you a story I love." It was Min who noticed it first. The blank book. He hadn't planned to snoop. He just wanted to understand. After all, he had been coming to the park bench every day for weeks, sitting cross-legged on the patchy grass with the rest of the kids, listening intently as Mr. Bin told stories that seemed to float right out of thin air. Min loved stories. He loved the way Mr. Bin made the voices change, how dragons growled, how princesses whispered, how trees sounded like they had secrets. But more than anything, Min loved the way Mr. Bin never seemed to need to look at the page. So one day after the story ended, and the other kids were too busy chasing each other around the swings, Min tiptoed up to the bench. Mr. Bin was still sitting there, the small brown book resting gently on his lap. "Ong oi," Min said softly, "can I see your book today?" Mr. Bin turned his head slightly. He smiled. "Of course." He held out the book with two hands, as though handing over something fragile, like a bird's egg or a whisper. Min took it carefully. It felt ordinary. The cover was worn but clean. The spine cracked slightly at the middle. It smelled faintly of dust and sunlight. Min opened it, then blinked. He flipped to the next page, then the next, and the next. Nothing. Every page was empty. He looked up at Mr. Bin, confused. There's no words in here." Mr. Bin nodded, the smile never leaving his face. "I know, but how do you read it?" Min asked. Mr. Bin tapped the side of his head gently. "Not all books are written with ink." Min sat down beside him. He kept flipping through the pages, just to be sure. Still blank, completely blank. That night, Min couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the man in the park who read stories from a book with no words. He thought about how Mr. Bin's eyes never quite looked directly at anything, how his fingers traced the edge of the bench before sitting down, how he always asked, "Are you all ready?" before he began, like he was sensing their presence rather than seeing them. Min sat up in bed. "Mom," he whispered. His mother stirred. "What is it? Is Mr. Bin blind?" His mother blinked. She sat up. "Where did you hear that?" No one told me. I just think he is. His mother thought for a moment, then said, if he is, then he's very special, because he's not just seeing with his eyes, he's seeing with memory. The next afternoon, Min arrived at the park early. Mr. Ben was already there, as always. The little brown book rested on his lap. Min sat on the bench this time, right next to him. Ông ơi, Min began hesitantly. Yes? Are you really blind? There was a pause. Then Mr. Ben turned his face slightly toward the boy. His clouded eyes looked serene. Yes, he said simply. For a long time now. Min looked down. But you tell so many stories. I remember them. All of them, Mr. Ben chuckled. Well, not every single one, but the good ones, the ones that stuck to my bones, I remember those. Why do you use a book then, if there's nothing in it? Mr. Ben smiled. It helps the little ones feel like there's magic in the pages. It gives them something to look at while they listen. Min thought about that, then asked the question he had been carrying quietly. Why do you come here every day? Mr. Ben leaned back, listened to the rustle of the trees. He took a breath. Because when I lost my sight, I lost a lot of other things too. My trauma, my friends, even the sound of people's voices faded, but stories stayed. He paused. And I realized maybe if I could remember them well enough, I could share them. And maybe then I wouldn't feel so alone. And neither would the children. That evening, Min stood at the dinner table and retold one of Mr. Ben's stories to his parents. He tried to mimic the dragon's voice. He forgot a few parts, but his parents clapped anyway. And when his father said, "That's a good one. Where did you hear it?" Min replied proudly, "From the man who reads without looking." The next day, Min brought his own notebook. He started writing down Mr. Ben's stories, word for word. He showed them to his classmates, who then brought their siblings. Before long, the crowd around the park bench doubled, then tripled. And while Mr. Ben never saw their faces, he heard their laughter, felt their stillness, listened to their questions. And to him, that was all the seeing he ever needed. One particular afternoon, a little girl named Leanne tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mommy, Mr. Ben never turns the page." Her mother blinked, then watched more closely. She had sat behind the children for days, quietly listening, and only now did she notice. Mr. Ben held the book, but his hands never moved. Not once. Not a single page flipped. When the story ended, she walked over. "Mr. Ben," she said gently, "you're not reading, are you?" He shook his head. "No, I'm remembering." She looked at the book, then at his face. Her eyes welled. "Thank you," she said, "for remembering enough to share." That week, someone brought a voice recorder. Another brought art supplies. The children began to draw scenes from the stories and post them on a board near the bench. Soon the whole corner of the park became a living mural of dragons, enchanted trees, magical stones, and floating islands. And above it all, a sign: "Stories live here." No one claimed to have written it, but everyone knew who it belonged to. Later that month, a librarian came to visit. She approached Mr. Ben with a soft smile. "I heard about you from a parent. I'd love to record your stories, maybe even print them in a small book for the children." Mr. Ben tilted his head. "A book?" "Yes, with illustrations. Would that be all right?" He smiled. "I suppose that would be the first book I've read without reading it myself." They both laughed. The project began that weekend. Min helped transcribe the stories. The children drew illustrations. The librarian typed them up. And Mr. Ben every afternoon kept telling stories from his blank book, until the blank book didn't feel blank anymore. And perhaps that's what mattered most. That even when a book has no words, when a man has no sight, when a bench is just a slab of wood in a city park, someone can sit down, remember a story, speak it into the world, and change everything. It started like any other afternoon. The same sun spilled through the trees, dappling the cracked tiles and the worn wood of the old park bench. The same laughter drifted from the swings and the monkey bars, and Mr. Ben, as usual, sat quietly in his spot, the brown book resting gently in his lap. The children gathered with practiced excitement. Min arrived first, as he often did, plopping down in his favorite place right near Mr. Ben's feet, notebook in hand, ready to record every magical word. The other children followed in pairs and small groups, trailing giggles and crumbs from hastily eaten snacks. Mr. Ben waited until the giggling turned into whispers, until the rustling quieted into anticipation. Then, like always, he lifted the book, held it gently in both hands, and said, "Today I will read you a story I love." And like magic, the world held its breath. But that day, there was a new girl. Her name was Anne. She was 7, small for her age, with sharp eyes and a habit of fidgeting with the hem of her dress. She had moved into the neighborhood just last week and had only heard whispers from her older brother about a man who read stories from memory. Anne sat near the back, arms crossed, skeptical. The story that day was about a fox who wanted to touch the moon. Mr. Ben told it with his usual cadence, gentle, warm, filled with just the right pauses and flourishes. The children gasped when the fox leaped across treetops. They giggled when he slipped into a bakery to steal moon-shaped buns. They fell silent when the fox sat, defeated, beneath the stars. And they cheered when, at last, the moon sent down a single silver feather to land at his paws. As the story ended, Mr. Ben closed the book with a quiet thud. The children clapped. Some jumped to their feet. Men scribbled notes furiously, but Anne stayed seated. Her hand rose. "Ongoi," she said. Mr. Ben turned his head gently. "Yes." Anne stood. Her voice was small but firm. "How do you know where the pages are if you're blind?" The question silenced the park. Not because it was rude, but because it was real. Even Min froze, his pencil halfway through writing the word feather. Mr. Ben smiled softly. "That's a very good question." Anne blinked. I just thought, if you don't see, how can you know where to turn the page?" Mr. Ben gently placed the book beside him on the bench. "I don't turn the pages," he said. Anne frowned. "But you said you were reading." He nodded. "I did, because that's what it feels like, even if the words aren't on paper." A moment passed, then another, and then Anne asked again, "Then where are the stories from?" Mr. Ben tapped his temple. "From here, from memory." "And you remember all of them?" "No," he said gently, "but the ones I do, I remember because I needed them. And now maybe you need them too." That night, Anne told her parents about the story. She told them how the fox had failed, and still the moon noticed him. She told them about the book with no pages, and the man who remembered stories in the dark. Her mother listened, then whispered, "Do you think he remembers them because he doesn't want to forget?" Anne thought, then said, "No, I think he remembers them because we need someone to remember for us." The next day, Anne brought a flashlight. She handed it to Mr. Ben before the story began. "In case it gets dark early," she said. Mr. Ben laughed. "You're thoughtful, but you won't use it, right?" she asked him. He shook his head. "No, but maybe someone else will, after I'm done." By the end of that week, everything changed. Mr. Ben's story bench became a meeting place. Parents stayed. Some teachers visited. Even teenagers began to linger nearby, pretending to be uninterested, but pausing when a dragon's growl or a princess's secret slipped through the trees. The librarian returned with a small recording device. The local community center posted about him online. And someone, a quiet someone, taped a note to the bench. "We come for the stories, but we stay for the man who never left us." Min began compiling a storybook with Anne's help. She had become his fiercest editor, insisting that foxes wouldn't say that, or that the moon would have glowed more gently in that scene. They printed small pages, added hand-drawn illustrations, bound them with string, and titled it, "The Book with No Pages." When they gave it to Mr. Bin, he ran his fingers along the cover. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "This is the first book I've ever owned that others wrote for me." And when he turned to the first page, he laughed. Because instead of a story, it simply said, "For Mr. Bin, who taught us that words don't need eyes." That evening, the park glowed. Children brought their parents. Parents brought their neighbors. Someone set up a speaker. Someone brought candles. And Mr. Bin, seated on his usual bench, began a story not from the brown book, but from his heart. This one is for the girl who asked the question that changed everything. And Anne, sitting front and center, smiled so wide her whole face lit up. The question had been simple, but it had peeled back a curtain, not just on Mr. Bin's blindness, but on the vision he carried. That stories weren't about the teller. They were about the space between people, and that sometimes to bring light to others, all it takes is someone willing to sit on a bench day after day and whisper into the air, "I remember this one." Before the bench, before the stories, before the laughter of children echoed beneath the park's aging trees, there was silence. And darkness, not the kind that creeps in with nightfall and is chased away by dawn, but a darkness that settles inside you slowly, patiently, a darkness that becomes home. Mr. Bin had not always been blind. In his younger days, his world had been color. He had been a teacher, literature mostly, with a deep love for ancient folk tales and poems that sang without melody. He wore glasses, thick-rimmed and always slipping down his nose. He carried stacks of papers and red pens in every pocket, and he had a laugh that filled a room like music you didn't know you missed until it stopped. He lived with his wife, Hyen, in a small apartment filled with books and the scent of green tea. They had no children, but the neighborhood knew them as Ongba Kechuyen, the storytellers. Every weekend, their apartment would swell with the sound of small footsteps and curious voices, children from every floor who came for the cookies, but stayed for the tales. And Mr. Bin loved telling them. He didn't read from books then either. He recited. He painted pictures with words, described colors like flavors, described magic as though it had a scent. He remembered everything, and then he began to forget. At first it was small things, street signs blurred, books seemed darker. He thought it was fatigue, a side effect of grading too many essays late into the night. But it wasn't. The doctor confirmed it gently. Degenerative vision loss, irreversible, inevitable. He was 49. Too young, the doctor said. Too old, he thought, to start over. Losing sight was not like flipping a switch. It was more like fog, thickening, spreading. One day he could see the outline of a tree, the next only its shadow. Eventually, even shadows disappeared. And with them, so did his job, his classroom, his chalkboards, his red pens. He tried to memorize voices, tried to walk the streets by counting steps. But the world, once painted in vivid strokes, became muffled, muted, gray. And then Hien died. It was sudden, a quiet illness that spoke loudly only in its final days. She had been his compass, his light. When she passed, the darkness deepened, not just in his eyes, but everywhere. He stopped telling stories, stopped leaving the apartment, stopped speaking unless spoken to. Neighbors whispered, children asked. But Mr. Bin had disappeared, not physically, but in all the ways that mattered. One evening, nearly 2 years after Hien's passing, Mr. Bin sat on his balcony. He held one of her old books. He couldn't read it, but he could smell it, touch the worn edges, feel the indentation where her fingers once turned pages. And he remembered a story she used to love. A story of a man who lost everything but his memory, and how that memory lit up a village every winter. He whispered it aloud, to no one. But as the words left his lips, something shifted. For the first time in years, he felt warmth, like someone had lit a lantern in his chest. He whispered another story, then another, until the night swallowed his voice. The next morning he walked, cane in hand, tentative, but steady. He found the park by instinct, found the bench by feel, and sat. At first no one came. Then a curious child passed by, then another, then a few stayed, and he began to speak. And the light inside him flickered to life. When people ask him now how he remembers so much, he says, "Because I had to. The stories are how I survived." And it's true. In a world that faded before his eyes, the stories were anchors. They gave shape to his days, purpose to his silence. He couldn't see the faces of the children, but he heard their gasps, felt their stillness, heard the tiny sniffles when a tale grew sad, felt the laughter ripple across the grass. And in that, he saw everything. He once told men, "Memory is a kind of vision. It shows you where you've been, and sometimes, if you're lucky, where you still belong." Min asked, "Do you ever miss seeing?" Mr. Bin thought for a long time, then said, "I miss the face of the woman I loved. But when I tell her favorite story, I swear I can see her smile." One afternoon, Anne brought a photo. It was a picture of the park, dozens of children sitting around the bench, their faces upturned, their eyes wide. She placed it in Mr. Bin's hands. "I know you can't see it," she said, "but I wanted you to feel what we look like when we listen." Mr. Bin ran his fingers over the glossy surface. He smiled. "I don't need to see the picture," he said, "because I already remember it." And perhaps that's what his stories had become. Not just entertainment, not just nostalgia, but vision. For those who listened, for those who learned to see through the warmth of his voice, for those who understood that sometimes it takes a man who cannot see to teach a whole neighborhood how to truly look. That day, Mr. Bin ended his story with something new. "I used to be afraid of the dark," he said. "But then I realized darkness is just the beginning of every story. Because what's a tale if not a light we carry inside us?" And the children clapped. The parents wiped their eyes. And the sun slipped lower through the trees, not to say goodbye, but to remind them, even without sight, some eyes never stop seeing. Stories have strange roots. They don't just live in pages or voices, they live in people. And like seeds, they grow quietly in the corners of hearts, waiting for the right moment to bloom again. Mr. Bent never expected the children to return. Not after they grew taller, not after their voices changed, not after they disappeared into high school uniforms, cell phones, and the unspoken urgency of growing up. But they did. And when they came back, they brought with them memories Mr. Ben didn't know he'd given. It started with a girl named Lon. Mr. Ben hadn't heard her name in almost 7 years. She had been one of the early listeners, the kind who always sat with her legs tucked to the side, hands neatly folded, eyes wide. One day she stopped coming. Mr. Ben never asked why. He had learned that children leave quietly, the way sunsets fade, without apology, without notice. But then one Thursday afternoon, as the shadows stretched long across the grass, a soft voice called out, Ben." He turned his head. He knew that voice. Older now, deeper, but unmistakable. "Lan!" She sat beside him. He could feel her presence before she even spoke again. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "For what?" "For the story of the girl who gave away her shadow," she said. "I never forgot it. I think about it every time I do something brave." Mr. Bin smiled. That was Hien's favorite, too. Lon placed something on the bench, a small hand-sewn book, inside her own stories. Mr. Bin ran his fingers across the fabric cover. "You're a writer? Because of you." That same week, a young man in a college sweatshirt stopped by. He didn't sit, just stood awkwardly near the edge of the group. When the story ended, he approached. "I used to come here when I was 8. Mr. Bin tilted his head. "You asked me once if clouds had feelings." The young man laughed. "I did?" "Yes," Mr. Bin said. "And then you said maybe rain was just the sky's way of hugging us." The young man's eyes filled. I just wanted to say you helped me get through some stuff." Mr. Bin placed a hand gently on the boy's shoulder. "You got through it because you kept listening, even when no one was talking." Soon it became a ripple. Children who had once sat cross-legged in the grass now returned with car keys in their pockets, with exams in their bags, with time scribbled across their foreheads. But they sat again, quiet, attentive, different, but still the same inside. They brought coffee, fruit, letters. One brought an old drawing, crayon on paper faded by time. A dragon with crooked wings and Mr. Bin seated on its back. "You told this story the day I found out my parents were divorcing," the girl said. "It made me feel safe." Mr. Bin didn't respond. He simply held the paper to his heart and nodded. Parents noticed. They whispered to each other. "He's not just telling stories," one said. "He's giving them back their childhoods." Another said, "It's like the bench remembers who they were." And perhaps it did, because the moment they sat, the noise of the outside world melted. They weren't students or employees or tired 20-somethings. They were just kids again, waiting for the man with the brown book to begin. Min, now a high school senior, became a bridge. He organized a weekend gathering, a sort of reunion for all the former listeners. He called it the Circle of Stories. Flyers were made, emails sent. Old friends messaged each other. "You remember the bench? Still there, still telling. I heard he's blind." He always was. I never knew. That's because he made us feel like we were the ones who could see. The day of the event, the park was filled. Not just children, not just teenagers, but adults. Some came with kids of their own. One woman brought her daughter and whispered, "I want her to hear the man who taught me what kindness sounds like." They brought blankets, chairs, baskets of food, and stories. So many stories, not just Mr. Bin's, but their own. And when he sat on the bench that day, he didn't hold the brown book. He held a microphone, and they told him the stories, one by one, of how his tales had made them brave, made them laugh, made them feel seen when they were invisible. And for once, Mr. Bin listened, truly listened, not as a storyteller, but as a receiver. Tears came, not of sadness, but of recognition, the quiet joy of knowing he had mattered. That in a world where people come and go, he had been an anchor, a quiet lighthouse in a busy city, a man who, without sight, had taught hundreds how to see themselves. That evening, as the sun sank and the crowd slowly faded, Mr. Bin sat alone for a moment. He ran his fingers across the wood of the bench, familiar grooves, familiar cracks. He whispered to himself, "I thought I was giving stories, but maybe I was just giving a place to come back to." And he was right, because they came back, not for nostalgia, but for connection, for the feeling of being 8 years old again, listening to the sound of a voice that believed in wonder, and for the reminder that no one is ever truly forgotten, not if their story keeps being told. It began with a low rumble in the not loud, just a warning, a distant reminder that even the sunniest days must bow to the clouds eventually. The park that day was unusually quiet. Leaves rustled with unease. Birds fluttered lower, closer to shelter, and Mr. Bin, seated on his usual bench, tightened his grip on the old brown book that rested on his lap. He had arrived early, as always. The children had not. Not yet. The clouds above were a deep gray, brushing the tops of the trees like they had secrets to whisper. The kind of clouds that made umbrellas nervous and parents whisper, "Not today, not in this weather." But Mr. Bin waited, because that's what he always did. Because even in the rain, stories don't stop. By 4:10 p.m., a few children appeared, dripping, grinning, shoes splashing in shallow puddles. Min was first, of course. His backpack was double-strapped and covered in plastic. He had brought an umbrella, but not for himself. He ran straight to Mr. Bin, opened the umbrella, and held it above both their heads. "I thought you might be alone today," Min said. Mr. Bin chuckled. "Not with you around." By 4:20 p.m., 5 more children arrived, then 3 more. By 4:30 p.m., there were nearly 20 kids sitting in the wet grass, soaked to their socks. Not a single complaint among them. One girl had brought a small tarp and laid it out so the youngest ones wouldn't sit directly on the muddy ground. Anne came with a box of warm buns still steaming. Lon, now a university student, handed out plastic ponchos she had collected from her part-time job. And then someone brought a speaker, set it behind the bench, in case Mr. Bin needed help projecting his voice over the rain. The first drop hit Mr. Bin's wrist at exactly 4:32 p.m., then another, then 1,000. But no one moved. No one flinched. Mr. Bin, under Min's umbrella, tilted his head to the sky and smiled. "You all came," he said. "Of course," someone answered. "It's story time." And so he began. "Today I will read you a story I love." The story was about a village that never saw sunlight. A place where the sky was always cloudy, the ground always damp. People in that village had forgotten how colors looked, how warmth felt. Until one day, a girl arrived with a box of light. She didn't open it immediately. She waited, watched, listened. And then, when she was sure they needed it most, she opened the box. And light spilled out, not just golden and bright, but warm enough to melt even the coldest hearts. The villagers wept, not because of the light, but because someone had waited long enough to share it. As the story unfolded, the rain fell harder, but the children leaned in closer. They weren't just listening. They were anchoring themselves to the words, to each other, to something invisible but deeply real. Mr. Bin's voice was steady. Rain pounded against the trees. Water trickled through the roots, but a story rose above it all. A mother arrived with a worried look. She carried an umbrella, searching for her son. She found him, soaked but smiling. She opened her mouth to scold him, but then she heard the story, and she stopped, and sat, and listened. Others came too, neighbors, passers-by, people who had never stopped before. Something about the sight, a circle of wet children huddled around a blind storyteller, was impossible to ignore. A man took off his jacket and laid it over a small boy's shoulders. A woman pulled a thermos from her purse and passed it down the line. The rain had brought them together, but it was the story that kept them there.